I never thought my life would end up like this at 44. I had imagined I'd have everything figured out by now. Love, purpose, the kind of constant companionship that fills the quiet moments. Instead, I found myself in a relationship with a man I barely knew, simply because loneliness had whispered in my ear for too long. Will wasn't a bad person. He was kind and dependable in a way that made things comfortable, but there was no excitement, no restless longing when he held my hand. We'd been seeing each other for a few months now, having quiet dinners together and exchanging obligatory kisses at the door. It was companionship, nothing more. He never stirred anything deeper in me, never made my skin tingle with an unknown feeling. But Jim was different. My son had always been the bright spot of my life, my laughter on difficult days, my proof that I had done something right. At 24, he carried himself with an effortless confidence, a man completely comfortable in his own skin. He lived for the road, the hum of a motorcycle beneath him, and the brotherhood of bikers who lived as freely as he did. He was wild and full of life in a way that both worried me and made me proud. Jim and I had always been close, closer than most mothers and sons. He told me things other boys might not tell their mothers, confided in me about his biker gatherings, the rush of the wind when he rode, and the girls who flirted with him at the bars. I listened, laughing at his stories, even when I didn't fully understand them. I wasn't part of that world, the leather, the rumbling engines, the tattoos. But I supported him in it. It was his life and I loved him for it. Will, however, didn't share the same enthusiasm. "You encourage it too much," he told me one evening while we sat on the porch. "The biker thing. He's young, but he should be focusing on something stable." I frowned, the words feeling wrong in my chest. He loves it. It makes him happy. Will exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I just think he should be thinking about the future." That was where Will and I were different. Jim was my future, not in the way a man was supposed to be, but in the way that truly mattered. I had spent years raising him, shaping him into the person he was. There was no greater joy in my life than seeing him wild and free. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Will's words still swirling in my mind. The thought of Jim changing, of him giving up the life that made him feel alive, made my chest tighten. I wouldn't let anyone, especially a man I wasn't even sure I loved, convince me otherwise. The next afternoon, Jim showed up unannounced. The roar of his bike echoed through the neighborhood as I watered my plants on the porch. He pulled up, swinging his leg off the bike in one smooth motion, grinning at me as he removed his helmet. "Miss me?" he teased. I rolled my eyes but smiled. "You were here 2 days ago." "That's 2 days too long," he said, stepping onto the porch and planting a kiss on my cheek. His lips were warm from the sun, and I had to fight the shiver that crept up my skin. I set the watering can down and crossed my arms. "What do you want?" Jim smirked. "Can't a guy visit his favourite lady?" I laughed softly, shaking my head. He had always been charming in a way that was impossible to resist. "You hungry?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Starving," he admitted, following me inside. I moved to the kitchen, pulling leftovers from the fridge while he leaned against the counter, watching me. His presence filled the room as it always did, and I found myself acutely aware of him, the way his shirt clung to his chest, the way his fingers drummed idly on the countertop as I reheated the food. "You still being that guy?" he asked. I stiffened slightly but kept my attention on the stove. "Will, yeah?" Jim made a noise of disapproval. "You don't sound too excited about it." I sighed, turning to face him. "It's not exciting, but it's nice to have someone." His eyes darkened slightly. "You don't need someone, Ma. You've got me." There was something in the way he said it, something quiet but certain, that made my stomach tighten. I forced a laugh, brushing off the moment. "That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" His voice was low, almost challenging. I opened my mouth to respond, but the microwave beeped, cutting through the tension. I turned away, busying myself with plating the food. Jim didn't push the matter, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Later that night, after he had eaten and stayed longer than necessary, Jim finally stood to leave. He hesitated at the door, his helmet tucked under his arm. "Come to the party this weekend." I blinked at him. "What, the biker party Saturday night?" "Come on," he smirked. "You'd fit in more than you think." "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "Think about it," he urged, leaning in to press another kiss on my cheek before heading out. I stood there for a long while after he left, staring at the empty space where he had been. For the first time in a long time, I thought about doing something completely out of character. Maybe I would go to that party. Maybe I wanted to see him in his world. Maybe I wanted to understand the way he looked at me today. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. The tight black jeans hugged my curves in a way I hadn't thought about in years. The leather jacket Jim had suggested felt foreign but powerful draped over my shoulders. I had even tousled my hair, giving it a wild, untamed look, and the deep red lipstick I rarely wore made me feel like someone else entirely, someone reckless, someone bold, someone who belonged in Jim's world. I hesitated when I first put the outfit on, staring at my reflection, wondering what I was doing. A biker party? Me? I had spent my life in book clubs, dinner parties, quiet Sunday mornings, not roaring engines, fire shows and leather-clad strangers drinking under the open sky. And yet, when Jim knocked on my door that evening, the look in his eyes when I stepped out made all my doubts vanish. "Jesus, Ma," he breathed, taking me in from head to toe. His expression was unreadable for a moment, something flickering behind those familiar brown eyes before he grinned. "You look damn good." His voice was different, rougher, and for the first time, it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't just a joke to him. Maybe he had actually wanted me there. "You think so?" I asked, smoothing the leather against my arms. Jim let out a low chuckle, stepping closer. "Oh, I know so." And with that, he held out his hand. "Let's go." The moment we arrived at the party, I knew I had made the right choice. The atmosphere was electric. Dozens of bikes lined up under string lights, their chrome gleaming under the setting sun. People were everywhere, laughing, drinking, music blasting from unseen speakers. The air smelled of gasoline, smoke, and something sizzling on a nearby grill. Jim held onto my waist as we walked in together, and I felt the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward us. Conversations paused. Beer bottles froze halfway to lips. The shock rippled through the crowd like a gust of wind. "Jim, man, who's the—" One of the guys started but trailed off, eyes wide as he took me in. "This," Jim said, pulling me a little closer, "is my mother." A beat of silence followed before, almost simultaneously, voices erupted around us. "No way!" "She looks like Jim." "You sure you're not messing with us?" Someone whistled low, and a woman with bright blue hair nudged Jim's shoulder with a teasing grin. "Damn, Jim, your mom's a knockout." I should have felt embarrassed, but instead I found myself smiling at the way people looked at me. Admiring, surprised, intrigued. It was something I hadn't felt in years. Not since I was young. Not since before Jim. "You guys are ridiculous," I said lightly, shaking my head. "I'm just here for the show." Jim tightened his grip on my waist, his fingers pressing into my side as he leaned in slightly. "Yeah," he murmured. "But I don't think they're going to stop talking about you all night." He wasn't wrong. Throughout the evening, I caught whispers whenever I passed, compliments, jokes, even a few bold attempts at flirting. Jim, however, never left my side. He introduced me to his closest friends, always keeping an arm around me, as if claiming me in some way. Whenever someone got a little too bold, his hand would tighten around my hip, or he'd pull me into his side with a casual touch. At first, I told myself it was just protective. Jim had always been that way with me, but the way my pulse quickened every time he touched me, the way my breath caught when his lips brushed too close to my ear as he spoke, it wasn't motherly. And it certainly wasn't son-like. The fire show began just as night fell, and the entire party gathered around a massive open space. The performers, bare-chested men and fierce-looking women in leather, twirled flaming staffs, swallowing fire and spitting it back out in dazzling arcs. The heat of the flames danced across my skin, making me shiver despite the warmth. Jim stood behind me, his chest nearly touching my back, his hands resting lightly on my waist. When I swayed slightly in awe, he steadied me, his fingers flexing against my sides. I knew I shouldn't have liked it as much as I did. By the time the fire show ended, I was breathless, my heart still racing. The moment was interrupted when a few of the guys clapped me on the back. "You got a ride tonight?" Alicia, one of them, asked. "No way you can come to one of these and not get on a bike." I laughed, shaking my head. "Oh, I don't know." "Come on," another chimed in. "You'd love it. Bet you'll start showing up every week." Jim chuckled behind me, but when I turned to look at him, his smile was different. He stepped closer, reaching up to tuck a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered against my skin, warm and firm. "Ma," he murmured, just low enough for only me to hear. "Can you ride it?" The question sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, swallowing past the tightness in my throat. "Yeah, I can." He grinned, stepping back as one of the guys handed me a helmet. "Let's see it then." And so I did. I swung my leg over the bike, gripping the handlebars as the engine roared to life beneath me. The power thrummed through my veins, and suddenly I understood why Jim loved this world so much. It wasn't just about bikes, it was about freedom. The moment I took off, the wind rushed against my skin, pulling laughter from my lips. The cheers and whistles from the crowd faded behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt truly, wildly alive. When I returned, the applause was deafening. People clapped, shouted, and smacked my back like I had just become one of them. Jim, however, was silent. He stood there watching me, his expression unreadable. Then, as I took off my helmet, he stepped forward. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing his fingers against my cheek before leaning in and pressing a firm kiss to my forehead. "Good," he murmured, his voice low and thick. "Very good." I should have laughed it off. Should have shaken my head and teased him like I always did. But I didn't. Because for the first time since the night began, I saw the way Jim looked at me. It was not the way a son looked at his mother. Something shifted after that night. I told myself it was just the thrill of the ride, the rush of breaking out of my routine, of being seen not as someone's mother, not as just another woman in her 40s filling the silence of her life with a man she didn't love, but as someone alive. But I couldn't deny it. It wasn't just the party. It wasn't just the bike. It was Jim. The way he had looked at me, the way his hands lingered, the way his voice dropped when he spoke close to my ear, the way my heart had tightened when he pressed that kiss to my forehead, murmuring, "Very good." That night, after I got home, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, still in that leather jacket, my hair wild from the wind, my lips still tinted red. I looked different. Not like a mother, not like a woman pushing through middle age, clinging to a man she barely felt anything for. I looked like a woman who had been wanted. I didn't sleep much that night. Jim started coming around more often after that. It wasn't unusual for him to stop by, but there was a new energy now. Something thick and electric stretching between us. In the quiet moments, he lingered longer, found reasons to stay. The second night after the party, he showed up with takeout, knocking on my door like he always did. "Brought dinner," he said, grinning as he held up a bag of greasy burgers and fries. "Figured I owed you after you put on a show for my friends the other night." I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "So what's this?" I asked. "A celebration dinner?" Jim smirked as he set the food down and pulled off his leather jacket. "Something like that. You were the star of the night, you know." I rolled my eyes, grabbing the plates. They were clearly surprised that I wasn't an elderly woman in a cardigan. Jim shot me a look and shook his head. "They were surprised because you looked damn good." I paused, my grip tightening around the plates. His voice had changed again, lower. I swallowed and forced a smile as I turned away. "Well, I'm glad you found it entertaining," I said. Jim didn't say anything for a moment, but I could feel his gaze on me. Dinner was simple, at least on the surface. We talked as we always did, laughing, teasing, and sharing stories. But beneath all of that, something else was there, something neither of us wanted to address. Jim sat closer than usual. His knee brushed mine under the table, and his hand lingered when he passed me a drink. I didn't pull away. It started in small ways at first. Touches that lasted a little too long, the way he would watch me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way I found myself holding my breath when he leaned in too close. I should have stopped it, should have made things clear, but I didn't because I liked it. I liked the way Jim looked at me now, not like I was just his mother, but like I was something more. A week later, Will came over. I had been avoiding him since the party, not intentionally, but something inside me pulled away from the idea of his presence, the dullness of it. He sat on the couch sipping coffee, talking about work and a vacation he wanted to take. "I was thinking we could get away for a bit," he said, smiling at me. "Somewhere quiet, maybe the mountains." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about the way Jim had held onto me at the party, the way his lips brushed against my forehead, the way I had felt something real for the first time in years. "Alicia?" I blinked, focusing back on Will. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." It was a lie. That night, Jim came over. It was late, almost midnight, when I heard his bike outside. I had just gotten out of the shower, my hair still damp, wearing nothing but a thin tank top and sleep shorts. When I opened the door, Jim stood there, his hands in the pockets of his jeans, his face unreadable. "Hey," I said, surprised. "Everything okay?" He nodded, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Just wanted to see you," he said casually, but his voice had an edge to it, something deeper than his usual playfulness. I closed the door behind him, folding my arms across my chest. "Jim, it's late." "I know," he replied, looking at me, really looking at me, his eyes taking in my damp hair, my bare arms, my legs. I should have told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I swallowed and turned toward the kitchen. "You want a drink?" Jim followed me, leaning against the counter as I poured whiskey for both of us. When I handed him his glass, our fingers brushed and neither of us pulled away. I met his gaze and the air between us shifted, thick and charged. "Are you going to tell me what's on your mind?" I asked quietly. Jim took a slow sip of his drink, keeping his eyes locked on mine. "You looked happy the other night," he said, finally. "At the party." I swallowed. "I was," I replied, shaking my head with a soft laugh. "With you." Jim set his drink down on the counter and reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear, just like he had at the party. This time, his hand didn't move away. His fingers lingered, brushing lightly against my skin. I didn't stop him. "Jim," I whispered, my voice barely audible. His fingers trailed down, brushing along my jaw before stopping at my collarbone. I could feel my pulse racing under his touch. He exhaled sharply, stepping back slightly, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "I should go," he muttered. I should have agreed, but instead I said, "Stay." Jim froze. His eyes searched mine and my heart pounded so loudly I thought he might hear it. Finally he nodded, and just like that, everything changed. That night Jim stayed. We didn't talk much after that. We just sat together on the couch, the silence between us heavy with everything left unsaid. At some point I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped an arm around me, pulling me closer, and I let him. I let myself sink into his warmth, into the feeling of his body against mine. I let myself forget, just for a little while, that this was supposed to be wrong. Because in that moment, it didn't feel wrong at all. Jim started coming over more often. At first, it was just extra visits here and there, showing up for dinner unannounced, bringing food or beer like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then he started staying later, falling asleep on my couch, leaving extra clothes in my spare bedroom. And one day, he just never left. It wasn't something we discussed. No conversation, no decision made. It just happened. His bike was always in my driveway, his jacket draped over the chair, his presence filling the house like it had always been there. I told myself it was just temporary, that he was just visiting more, but deep down I knew Jim had come home, and I had let him. I broke things off with Will the way a person rips off a Band-Aid, quick and clean, painless. At least that's what I wanted. We were sitting in a quiet cafe when I told him. I had chosen the public place on purpose, hoping it would soften the blow, keep things civil. "I think I need some time," I said, stirring my coffee without really drinking it. Will frowned. Time. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. I don't think this is working the way it should, and it's not fair to either of us if I keep pretending. Pretending? His voice was sharp now, edged with disbelief. Where is this coming from, Alicia? I thought we were fine. Fine. That word had followed me throughout this whole relationship. Fine. Not passionate, not thrilling, not full of fire or warmth. And I wasn't fine anymore. I was alive. It's just something I need to do, I said, exhaling softly. I can't explain it. Will stared at me, his jaw tight. There's someone else, isn't there? I flinched. I should have denied it. I should have told him he was imagining things, but I didn't. I just need time, I repeated. Will leaned back, running a hand over his face. He was hurt. I could see it. But more than that, he was frustrated. Not because he had lost something precious, but because he didn't understand. And that was exactly why I needed to leave first. Will left me alone, but then the messages started. Then the calls. At first, they were polite, concerned. Are you okay? Can we talk? I just want to understand. Then they became more frequent. I deserve an explanation, Alicia. You can't just throw this away without telling me why. Then one day I came home to find him standing on my porch. Jim wasn't there that evening. He had gone out for a ride with his friends, leaving me with a rare moment alone. But now, standing on my doorstep, I wished Jim had been there. Will? I kept my voice even, but my stomach twisted. What are you doing here? He shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. You won't answer my calls. What was I supposed to do? I told you I needed time. No, you gave me nothing, he shot back, his voice growing tense. You just walked away. Don't I deserve to know why? I folded my arms. You deserve someone who wants to be with you, Will. And that's not me. His expression darkened. Is it him? My breath caught. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Your son. Something inside me went ice cold. I don't know what you're talking about, I said carefully. Will scoffed. Come on, Alicia. Do you think people don't notice? Do you think I didn't notice? He's always around, like he owns you. A chill ran down my spine. He noticed. I swallowed. Will, you need to leave. He didn't move at first, just stood there watching me, his chest rising and falling. Then finally he let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. And then he was gone. Jim found me later that night sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. He walked in, smelling like the road, like cool air and gasoline. And when he saw me, he stopped. What happened? His voice was sharp. I swallowed, shaking my head. Nothing. Jim wasn't buying it. He stepped forward, crouching in front of me, resting his hands on my knees. Ma? I looked at him, then at the concern in his eyes, the way he watched me like I was the most important thing in the world. And just like that, I cracked. Will came by. Jim's body stiffened. What did he want? I hesitated, then finally whispered, He knows. The room went still. Jim's grip tightened slightly, his jaw clenched, but his voice when he spoke was calm. What did he say to you? Just accusations, I exhaled shakily. Nothing concrete. Jim nodded slowly, his hand sliding up to my waist, steadying me. Do you want me to handle it? His voice was low and controlled, but there was something dangerous beneath it. I shook my head. Number it's over, I ended it. Jim exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he stayed close, his hands still on my waist, his eyes locked onto mine for a long moment. We didn't speak. Then Jim reached up, brushing his thumb lightly against my jaw. You don't regret it? He murmured. I didn't ask what it was because I already knew. No, I whispered. I don't. Jim's lips parted slightly, his hands sliding up to frame my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheekbones. Then he kissed me, soft, slow, hesitant at first. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Because in that moment, with Jim's hands on me, his lips pressing gently against mine, I finally felt what I had been searching for all these years. Not just passion, not just desire, but home. Jim never left after that. We stopped pretending, stopped making excuses. He moved in with me, putting his things in my room instead of the spare. People whispered, people noticed, but I didn't care. For the first time in years, I wasn't lonely. I wasn't just waiting for life to pass me by. I'd found something real, something raw, something undeniable. And no matter what the world thought, I wasn't going to let it go. Because Jim wasn't just my son, he was mine.